They built a world where control was everything, where power meant keeping others small, predictable, obedient. A quiet system of dominance, masked as order, enforced through fear, manipulation, and silent rules nobody dared to question. And for a long time, it worked. Until you stepped in. Not louder than them. Not stronger in the way they understand strength, but different. Unpredictable. You didn't follow their script. You didn't react the way they expected. You saw through the illusion, and once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. That's when everything broke. Their confidence cracked, their influence weakened, because the moment one person refuses to play along, the entire structure starts trembling. And now they don't confront you. They don't challenge you. They don't even acknowledge you. Because your existence alone exposes everything they tried to hide. Fear was never an accident in their world. It was designed, refined, and carefully distributed like a quiet poison. Not loud enough to spark rebellion, but strong enough to keep people in line. They didn't need chains or force, because they understood something far more effective. The human mind breaks long before the body does. So they built an environment where doubt lived in every corner, where hesitation felt safer than action, and where questioning the system felt like stepping off a cliff. They didn't raise their voices much. They didn't need to. A look, a pause, a subtle shift in tone, that was enough. Because fear, when planted deeply, grows on its own. It teaches people to silence themselves, to second-guess their instincts, to shrink without being told. That was their version of control. Invisible, almost elegant in its cruelty. And the most dangerous part, they convinced everyone it was normal. That this quiet pressure, this constant need to stay in line, was just the way things worked. People adapted. They learned to survive within it. They traded authenticity for acceptance, courage for comfort. Not because they were weak, but because the system was designed to make resistance feel pointless. Strength, real strength, was never part of their equation. Because strength invites challenge. Strength creates unpredictability, and unpredictability is something they could never afford. So instead, they nurtured fear. They fed it slowly, carefully, making sure it never turned into panic. Just enough to keep everyone controlled, manageable, predictable. They studied reactions. They learned what made people hesitate, what made them doubt themselves, what made them step back instead of forward. And once they found those pressure points, they pressed them again and again until it became instinct. Until people stopped needing an external force to control them, because the control had already taken root inside. That's how dominance survives without ever showing its true face. It hides behind routines, expectations, unspoken rules. It doesn't announce itself because it doesn't have to. By the time someone notices it, they're already part of it, already shaped by it, already playing along without realizing the game. And fear in their hands was never chaotic. It was precise, measured, almost surgical. They knew that too much fear creates resistance, but just the right amount creates obedience. So they walked that line perfectly, keeping people uncomfortable enough to stay alert, but not brave enough to push back. It wasn't about making people fall. It was about making sure they never stood up in the first place. Patterns are where they feel safest. Predictable reactions, expected emotions, rehearsed outcomes. They don't need to win every time, as long as they know how the game will unfold. That's the comfort they cling to. The certainty that no matter what happens, people will respond the way they always have. Anger will be met with silence. Pressure will be met with compliance. Control will be met with quiet acceptance. You were supposed to follow that rhythm. Every move they made was based on assumption. They push, you step back. They test, you fold. They provoke, you react exactly the way they've seen 100 times before. That repetition is what gave them confidence. Not power, not intelligence. Repetition. The illusion that they understood people so well that nothing could surprise them anymore. Then you didn't. You didn't argue when they expected resistance. You didn't submit when they expected silence. You didn't react when they tried to provoke something out of you. And that absence of reaction, it wasn't weakness. It was disruption, because they weren't prepared for stillness. They weren't prepared for someone who refuses to play a role. That's the moment the pattern begins to crack. Confusion sets in first. Small, almost unnoticeable. A pause where there should have been certainty. A hesitation in their tone. They start replaying the situation, trying to figure out where it went wrong. But nothing makes sense, because the script didn't go as planned. And without the script, they're exposed. You see, patterns don't just control behavior. They protect the ones who create them. As long as everyone follows along, they never have to adapt. They never have to think beyond what they already know. It's a system built on predictability, and predictability makes them feel powerful. But you removed that. You became the variable they couldn't calculate, the response they couldn't anticipate. And once that happens, their control starts slipping in ways they can't immediately fix. Because control isn't just about what they do, it's about how others respond. And when the response changes, everything shifts. They might try to adjust at first, push a little harder, change their approach, test different angles to get you back into the pattern. But every time you refuse to fall into place, the cracks grow wider. Their confidence weakens, not because you attacked it directly, but because you made it unreliable. And nothing terrifies them more than uncertainty. Because without patterns, they have to face something they've avoided for a long time. The fact that their control was never absolute. It was conditional, dependent, fragile in ways they never admitted, even to themselves. You didn't overpower them. You didn't outplay them in the way they understand winning. You simply stopped being predictable, and in a system built entirely on expectation, that alone is enough to make everything start falling apart. Silence was never supposed to belong to you. In their world, silence was a tool they used, not something you were meant to control. It was meant to suppress, to corner, to make others feel small under its weight. When they went quiet, it carried meaning, disapproval, pressure, a warning without words. And most people understood that language instinctively. They rushed to fill the void, to explain themselves, to ease the tension. That's how the balance stayed intact. Because silence, when used by them, created discomfort. And discomfort made people predictable. It made them speak when they should have observed, react when they should have paused, reveal more than they intended. That's where control tightened. In those unguarded moments, where people tried too hard to fix something that was never broken. But when you took that silence for yourself, something shifted. You didn't rush to explain. You didn't try to ease the tension. You let it sit there, heavy and unanswered. And suddenly, the tool they relied on stopped working the way it was supposed to. Because silence in your hands didn't show weakness. It showed restraint. It showed awareness. It showed that you weren't desperate to be understood or accepted. That's what unsettled them. They weren't used to being on the other side of it. They weren't used to wondering what someone else was thinking, to questioning their own assumptions without getting immediate feedback. Your silence didn't give them anything to work with. No reaction to analyze, no emotion to manipulate, no words to twist. It turned the pressure back on them. Now they were the ones filling the gaps, overthinking small details, replaying interactions, trying to interpret something that wasn't meant to be explained. And the more they tried to understand it, the more uncertain they became. Because silence, when it's intentional, forces people to face their own thoughts without distraction. That's a space they never prepared for. They depended on noise, on constant reactions, constant engagement, constant validation that their presence had an effect. But your silence denied them that. It removed the feedback loop they were used to controlling. And without that loop, their influence started to fade in ways they couldn't immediately detect, but could definitely feel. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, almost invisible. But that's what made it powerful. Because while they were looking for confrontation, for resistance they could fight against, you gave them nothing, and nothing is impossible to control. Silence became your way of stepping outside their reach, not by running, not by hiding, but by refusing to participate in the game they built. It wasn't passive. It was deliberate. Every moment you chose not to react, not to engage, not to explain, you were breaking a cycle they depended on. And the more consistent that silence became, the more it changed the dynamic, not all at once, but gradually. Like pressure building in a place they couldn't see, couldn't measure, couldn't stop. They liked to believe their power came from authority, from position, from something solid and unquestionable. But that was never the truth. Their power was borrowed, piece by piece, from the people around them. It lived in compliance, in quiet agreement, in the subtle willingness of others to go along without resistance. Without that, their authority was just a performance with no audience. Obedience was the real currency, not forced, not demanded in obvious ways, but shaped over time. People learned what was expected. They learned when to nod, when to stay quiet, when to avoid pushing too far. It became second nature, almost automatic. And once it reached that point, control no longer needed effort. It maintained itself, sustained by habit, and reinforced by fear of stepping out of line. That's how their system stayed intact. Because as long as everyone followed the same unspoken rules, their influence appeared absolute. It felt natural, like it had always been that way and always would be. No one stopped to question it, not deeply enough to disrupt it. And the few who noticed the cracks were usually pulled back in before they could do anything about it. You were supposed to be no different. Another part of the structure. Another predictable response. Another quiet agreement that kept everything running smoothly. They didn't need to watch you closely, because they assumed you'd follow the same path as everyone else. That assumption was their blind spot, because the moment obedience disappears, even slightly, everything starts to shift, not loudly, not in a way that immediately draws attention, but in small, almost invisible ways. A hesitation where there used to be certainty, a refusal where there used to be compliance, and those small changes begin to add up, creating tension in a system that relies on consistency. They feel it before they understand it. Something isn't aligning the way it should. The responses aren't matching the expectations. The flow is interrupted, just enough to make them uneasy, and that uneasiness grows because they can't directly point to the cause. It's not open rebellion, not something they can confront or suppress easily. It's quieter than that. It's the absence of obedience, and absence is difficult to control. They might try to reassert themselves. Subtle reminders, indirect pressure, attempts to guide things back into place. But those methods only work when there's something to influence, when someone is still engaged, still responsive, still playing a role within the system. Once that connection weakens, their reach weakens with it. Because control isn't just about giving direction. It's about receiving a response. And when that response changes, becomes inconsistent or disappears entirely, their influence starts to lose its foundation. They can't force obedience the way they could before. Not without exposing the truth behind their power. And that's something they avoid at all costs. Because once it becomes visible, once people see that it was never as strong as it appeared, it risks unraveling completely. So they rely on what worked before, repeating the same patterns, applying the same pressure, expecting the same results. But those results don't come as easily anymore. The system starts to strain under its own weight, held together by something that is no longer fully there. And all of it traces back to a simple shift. The moment you stopped giving them what they needed most to survive, exposure was never part of the plan. Their system relied on staying just out of focus, existing in a space where people could feel it, but never quite define it. Because the moment something is clearly seen, it can be questioned. And the moment it's questioned, it begins to lose its grip. So they kept everything subtle, layered, just complex enough to avoid direct confrontation. They didn't need to hide completely. Just enough to make people doubt their own instincts. Enough to make them second guess what they were noticing. Because uncertainty is a powerful shield. When people aren't sure what they're looking at, they hesitate. And hesitation keeps the system safe. That's how the illusion held together. It wasn't built on something solid. It was built on perception. On the idea that everything was under control, that every reaction, every outcome, every dynamic was intentional and unshakable. And as long as that perception remained intact, no one dared to look deeper. You didn't try to expose anything. That's what makes it dangerous. You didn't stand up and point fingers. You didn't announce flaws or challenge them directly. You simply saw things for what they were and responded differently. And that quiet shift, that subtle change in awareness, did something they couldn't anticipate. It made the illusion visible without ever naming it. Because once someone sees clearly, they move differently. Your reactions didn't match the narrative anymore. You didn't treat their authority as absolute. You didn't respond to pressure as if it held the same weight. And that contrast created something uncomfortable, something they couldn't easily dismiss. It created reflection. Not just for them, but for anyone paying attention. Because when one person steps outside the illusion, it creates a reference point, a comparison. Others might not fully understand it, but they can feel that something is off. That maybe the system isn't as solid as it appears. And that's where the real disruption begins. They can handle resistance. They can deal with conflict. Those are visible, direct, something they know how to respond to. But exposure without confrontation is different. It doesn't give them anything to fight against. It doesn't provide a clear target to shut down or isolate. It just exists, quiet, undeniable, and increasingly difficult to ignore. They start noticing the shifts, the way interactions change around you, the way their usual tactics don't land the same way anymore, the way control feels slightly out of reach, like something slipping through their fingers, no matter how tightly they try to hold on. And the more they try to regain that control, the more visible the cracks become. Because control, when forced, stops looking natural. It starts revealing effort, intention, even desperation. And that's the opposite of what they built their image on. They depended on things appearing effortless, unquestioned, automatic. Now it feels strained. All because you didn't play along. You didn't expose them with words or actions meant to tear things down. You exposed them by simply not reinforcing the illusion they depended on. By not reacting the way they needed you to. By not validating what they presented as reality. And without that validation, the illusion doesn't disappear instantly. It lingers unstable, weakened, waiting for someone else to notice what you already did. Avoidance is never random. It looks like distance, like indifference, like silence from their side. But it's calculated in a way they won't admit. Because once someone becomes unpredictable, once someone stops responding in ways that can be measured and controlled, engagement turns into a risk, and they don't deal well with risk they can't manage. You didn't become louder. You didn't become aggressive. You didn't chase their attention or try to prove anything. You simply changed the way you existed around them, and that shift removed something they relied on, access. Not physical presence, but psychological access, the ability to read you, to anticipate you, to influence you. Without that, interaction becomes dangerous for them, because every conversation, every moment of contact carries uncertainty. They don't know what they'll get from you anymore. No predictable reaction, no emotional pattern to lean on, no clear outcome they can prepare for. And when control depends on predictability, uncertainty feels like a threat. So they step back. Not because they've lost completely, not because they understand exactly what happened, but because something no longer feels safe in the way it used to. The dynamic has shifted, and they can sense it even if they can't explain it. That's enough to make them cautious. Distance becomes their defense. They might frame it differently, make it look intentional, like they've chosen to disengage on their own terms. But underneath that surface, it's a reaction, a response to something they can't quite grasp. Because staying close would mean facing that uncertainty repeatedly, and they're not built for that. They rely on control to maintain their position, and when control isn't guaranteed, they look for ways to protect themselves. Avoidance is one of those ways. It limits exposure. It reduces the chances of being caught off guard. It keeps them within environments where they still feel stable. You disrupted that stability, not through force, not through confrontation, but through presence. The kind of presence that doesn't seek approval.